My name is Robert Martin, and the words that shattered me came in the form of a text. Don't come to my wedding. You're no longer my family. Imagine raising a daughter for 28 years only to be replaced by strangers she now calls her real parents. That night, staring at my late wife's photograph, I realized Emily had chosen wealth over blood image over loyalty. But she didn't know who I truly was. Not just a father, but a banker trained to follow money trails and expose fraud. And when the truth came out, her new family's empire would collapse in front of everyone. Before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. Don't come to my wedding. You're no longer my family. That single sentence glowed on my phone screen, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. 28 years of fatherhood dismissed in 12 words. My daughter Emily had always been strong-willed, but never cruel, not like this. I sat in my small living room, pension papers scattered across the coffee table, the ticking of the clock growing louder, as if mocking the silence that followed her message. My first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. I remembered the nights I carried her after nightmares, her little arms clutching my neck as if I were her only anchor in the world. I remembered her graduation, the tears in her eyes when she hugged me and promised she'd never forget what I'd sacrificed. And now I was disposable, pushed aside for Richard and Margaret Thompson, the wealthy couple who had bought her loyalty with checks and promises. Still, nothing prepared me for what I saw next. A notification lit up Emily's Facebook post. She'd written, "Finally found real parents. Thank you, Richard and Margaret, for making dreams come true." Beneath her words were smiling photos in a bridal shop. Margaret adjusting her veil, Richard handing over a platinum card at the counter. Strangers commented like they knew her best, so lucky to have such supportive parents. Not one mention of me. Not one. My chest tightened as if the walls of the house were closing in. I wanted to respond, to shout into that digital void that I was the man who raised her, who buried her mother, who kept her fed and educated when life gave us nothing but grief. But my hands froze. What would be the point? She had made her choice. That night I sat with her mother's photograph in my lap. Margaret had died believing Emily would be my comfort in old age, not the weapon of my deepest humiliation. My late wife had always told me, sometimes the strongest answer is silence. I didn't understand it then. But as I listened to my phone buzz with new notifications, likes, comments, shares, I finally did. My silence could become my strength. Emily thought she had shamed me. What she didn't realize was that I had been a banker all my life, a man who spent decades uncovering fraud, catching embezzlers, and tracing dirty money through clean accounts. If the Thompsons wanted to buy my daughter's love, I would show her exactly what their money was worth. And so, with trembling hands but a steady mind, I opened my old address book. I found the name of Stephen Clark, a former colleague turned private investigator. 5 years earlier, at his farewell party, he had said, "Call if you ever need anything." At the time, I never imagined I would. Tonight I did. Before I dialed, I whispered to my wife's picture, "Margaret, she may not see it now, but she will. She'll know the truth. $35,000, Dad. That's what I need." Her voice cut through the quiet evening before she'd even set her purse down. Emily stood in the doorway of my modest living room, still in her designer coat, car keys jingling in her manicured hand. She didn't bother with small talk, or even a hello, just that number spoken like a demand rather than a request. I folded my newspaper slowly, buying myself a moment. "Sweetheart, sit down. Let's talk this through. There's nothing to talk about." she snapped, pacing across the hardwood floor. The Thompsons already paid deposits for the venue, the flowers, the photographer. I just need you to cover your part. It's the most important day of my life, Dad. Don't ruin it. Her words stung, but I kept my tone even. Emily, I can give you $8,000. That's all my pension allows. After your mother's medical bills and the funeral, that's what I have left. She froze, then laughed bitterly as if I'd told a bad joke. 8,000, that's pathetic. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the bank statements. I spread them across the coffee table, rows of black and white numbers, documenting my careful, frugal life. This is the truth, Emily. It isn't about what I want. It's about what I have. Her hand shot out, sweeping the papers onto the floor. They fluttered down like fallen leaves, some landing beside framed photographs of family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthdays, moments I thought she cherished. Don't you dare bring Mom into this, she hissed when I mentioned the expenses after her illness. The Thompsons told me what real parents do. Richard took out a second mortgage for his son's wedding. Margaret sold her grandmother's jewelry. And you're just sitting here content with mediocrity. I bent to gather the scattered pages. My wife's photograph had slipped to the floor among them, her smile frozen in time. I picked it up gently, brushing away dust from the glass. Emily, I said quietly, what do you think your mother would say if she heard you now? She'd want me to be happy. Emily shot back, grabbing her purse. She'd want me to have the wedding I deserve. I stood slowly, the photo still in my hand. Would she want you to call your father a failure? For a split second, Emily hesitated. Then she whispered the word like a knife. Yes. A failure. That's exactly what you are. The air left my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't speak. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking like gunshots on the wood floor. I'll give you 1 week to figure it out, she called over her shoulder. Find the money, Dad. Because I'm not backing down. The door slammed, rattling the frame. Outside, her BMW, paid for by the Thompsons, purred to life and rolled away. I sank back onto the couch, the photo of my wife clutched in my hand. Margaret's eyes, calm and kind, seemed almost different now, sad as if she too had heard the word failure. That night, the silence in my house was louder than any insult. And for the first time, I understood that my daughter wasn't just asking for money. She was asking me to trade my dignity for her approval. Finally found real parents. Those were the words that glared back at me from the screen of my aging phone the next morning. I'd barely finished my first cup of coffee when the Facebook notification appeared, and curiosity betrayed me. I tapped. Emily's smiling face filled the screen, framed by mirrors and silk gowns in a bridal salon. Margaret Thompson stood behind her, adjusting the veil with practiced hands, while Richard lingered in the background, platinum credit card extended toward the cashier. Below the photo, my daughter had written, "Thank you, Richard and Margaret, for making dreams come true. Blessed with my new family." My hand trembled. Not a single word about me. Not a mention of the years I'd worked double shifts, the nights I'd studied with her when she struggled with math, the sacrifices her mother and I made. In that post, I was erased, replaced by strangers with deeper pockets. The comments cut deeper than the post itself. Such lucky parents to have you. Your new family is perfect. The Thompsons are angels. Over 50 comments within minutes, and each one twisted the knife further. I read them again and again, as if hoping my name would appear, as if someone would remember the man who had walked Emily through her childhood. But there was nothing. Just strangers celebrating a fiction that Richard and Margaret had been the ones to raise her. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, and clattered against the table, spilling cold liquid across the bank statements I had left there. Pages that told the story of my modest, honest life now stained with brown rings. It felt symbolic. My chest tightened with something heavier than grief, humiliation. The world now believed Emily had traded her failure of a father for benefactors who could buy her everything she wanted. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out an old leather-bound ledger, the same one I had used during my years as a banker. If there was one lesson I had learned in 3 decades of chasing embezzlers, it was this: document everything. With shaking hands, I began taking screenshots of the post, the photos, the comments. Each click was a strange comfort, a record, evidence, proof. I created a folder on my laptop and labeled it with her name, Emily Evidence. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a declaration of war. I stared at her words again, real parents, and I knew then that silence alone wouldn't be enough. My daughter needed to see the truth, not through lectures or pleas, but through cold, undeniable facts. As I straightened my wife's photograph on the mantel, I whispered, "Margaret, she's blind right now, but I'll make sure she sees." That morning, something shifted inside me. The father in me was broken, but the banker in me was awake. And the Thompsons, with their perfect smiles and bottomless wallets, were about to learn that they hadn't just stolen my daughter, they had challenged the wrong man. Failure. That word echoed through my mind long after Emily's BMW disappeared from my driveway. It clung to me like smoke poisoning the air in every room of my small house. I walked past the family photos on the wall, vacations we could barely afford, birthdays with homemade cakes, and suddenly wondered if she now saw all of it as proof of my mediocrity. That night I sat alone in the living room, my wife's picture balanced on my knee. Margaret's eyes were as steady as they'd been on the day we married, but in that moment I saw something else in her gaze, a sadness, maybe even disappointment. It was as if she too had heard our daughter's words, failure. I tried to sleep, but the word kept me awake. I replayed the scene, Emily's hands scattering my bank statements, her voice dripping with contempt, her cruel comparison to the Thompsons. I wasn't just hurt. I was humiliated. She had reduced my entire life to a number on a check I couldn't write. But sometime near dawn, the humiliation hardened into something colder. I remembered Margaret's quiet warning during one of Emily's teenage tantrums: sometimes the best response is no response at all. Back then, I'd thought she meant patience. Now I understood she'd meant something different. Silence could be a weapon. As the first light crept through the curtains, I went to my desk. The banker in me, the man who had spent decades unraveling embezzlement schemes, stirred awake. I pulled open drawers I hadn't touched in years. Old ledgers, sharpened pencils, even a magnifying glass I'd once used to pore over forged checks. My tools. My discipline. I began with a list: Richard and Margaret Thompson. Restaurant owners. Supposed philanthropists. Real parents. If Emily had sold me out for their money, then she would learn the true cost of their generosity. I wasn't going to shout or plead or beg. I was going to do what I had always done best: follow the money. From a leather-bound address book, I found a name written in blue ink: Stephen Clark. A former colleague turned private investigator. At his retirement party 5 years ago, he had told me, "If you ever need answers, Bob, call me." I never thought I would. Until now. I traced my finger over his number, then closed the book. Not yet. Timing was everything. If I called too soon, Emily would dismiss me as bitter. If I called too late, the Thompsons might cover their tracks. I needed to be precise, deliberate, just like I'd been in my banking career. By the time the sun was fully up, my house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a war room. The grief was still there, but it was no longer in control. I was Margaret. I whispered to the photograph, our daughter believes she's chosen a better family. But soon she'll see the truth. And when she does, she'll know exactly what kind of father she really has. I sat at my desk that evening, the house unusually still. The air felt heavy as though it understood the weight of the decision I was about to make. For hours, I stared at Stephen Clark's number in my old address book. I remembered him as a man with sharp instincts and a relentless work ethic, the kind of investigator who could unearth what others tried to bury. For years, I never thought I'd need him. But now, with my daughter's betrayal burning in my chest, I reached for the phone. Stephen Clark Investigations, came the voice on the other end. Professional, clipped exactly as I remembered. Stephen, I said, my voice lower than usual. It's Bob Martin, from First National Bank. There was a pause, then warmth. Bob. Well, I'll be damned. It's been years. How are you? I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I've been better. I need your help. His tone shifted, curiosity sharpening into business. What kind of help? Background checks. Richard and Margaret Thompson. Spokane. They own Thompson's Fine Dining. I need everything: financials, business practices, property records, legal issues. No detail too small. There was silence for a moment. Then he asked carefully, Bob, what's this about? You always struck me as a man who played things straight. I stared at the framed photograph on my desk, Emily at her high school graduation, hugging me with all the joy in the world. It felt like a memory from another life. Let's just say I need to know exactly who I'm dealing with. For family reasons. Stephen didn't push. All right. A full deep dive. My rate for that kind of job is $3,000. But for you, let's call it $2,000. Half now, half when I deliver. $2,000, nearly a quarter of what Emily demanded from me for her wedding. Somehow the irony made it easier to agree. Done. I'll send the transfer tonight. Good. Then give me every detail you've got: their business names, addresses, anything else that can narrow the search. I'll have preliminary results for you in a week. When we hung up, I sat back in my chair. For the first time since Emily called me a failure, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. The banker in me, the man who once prided himself on catching discrepancies no one else saw, was alive again. I opened my laptop and drafted a ledger page titled Operation Thompson. I logged the call, the payment, the details. Every good investigation started with clean records, and this one would be no different. As I closed the ledger, I looked once more at my wife's photograph. Margaret, I whispered, she won't believe me if I just tell her. But with proof, she'll have no choice. She'll see them for what they are. And then she'll see me again. That night, I turned off my phone, despite the buzzing of incoming calls. Emily's name flashed again and again, but I let it ring. My silence was no longer weakness. It was the first move in a game I intended to win. 83 missed calls. That's what my phone displayed after 3 days of silence. I hadn't answered a single one. Not Emily's, not Richard's, not Jason's. Each ring was another reminder of the choice I'd made to let silence speak louder than words. On the first day, Emily's messages had been sharp, her tone still coated in entitlement. Dad, maybe I was too harsh. Call me back so we can talk about this properly. She left 6 more voicemails that evening, each one less certain than the last. By day 2, Richard Thompson himself was leaving messages, his voice booming with authority. Mr. Martin, this childish behavior isn't helping anyone. We need to talk like men. He sounded like a man used to control a man not accustomed to being ignored. That alone was satisfying. By the 3rd day, desperation had crept into Emily's voice. Dad, please just call me. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean what I said. We can work this out. Her words cracked with something I hadn't heard from her in years: fear. I sat at the kitchen table with my old banking ledger open, documenting each call as if they were financial transactions. Caller time, tone of voice, duration. Day 1, curiosity. Day 2, frustration. Day 3, panic. The pattern was clear, predictable, and the longer I kept silent, the more they unraveled. Sometimes I would hold the phone in my hand as it buzzed, Emily's name glowing across the screen. For a fleeting moment, I almost answered. The father in me longed to reassure her, to tell her I was still here. But then I remembered the sting of her word's failure and the cruel post declaring strangers as her real parents. That memory hardened me again. No. She needed to learn that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt with apologies made too late. Instead, I spent my days methodically preparing. I cleaned out my closets, read books I hadn't touched in years, even mowed the lawn, while the phone vibrated endlessly on the counter inside. Each unanswered call was a small victory. For once, they needed me more than I needed them. At night, I would sit by the window and watch the neighborhood go about its ordinary routines: families walking dogs, couples cooking dinner together. Normalcy. And in that normalcy, I found strength. While Emily and the Thompsons spiraled, I stayed calm, anchored, and deliberate. By the end of the third day, I noticed something remarkable. I no longer felt like the humiliated man she'd called a failure. I felt like the banker again, the one who had spent decades unraveling lies, exposing fraud, and documenting every inconsistency until the truth stood undeniable. My silence was not weakness. It was strategy. As I closed my ledger that night, I whispered into the quiet room, 3 days and they're already cracking. Let's see how much longer they last. The call from Stephen came on a Tuesday afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the pines outside my kitchen window. His voice was steady, almost casual, but I could hear the weight in his words. "Bob, I've got something for you. Meet me tomorrow, Riverside Coffee, 3 o'clock. Bring a notebook." When Stephen told you to bring a notebook, it meant what he had couldn't be trusted to memory. I arrived early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines. Years of auditing had taught me the value of positioning. Never let your back face the door. When Stephen walked in, he was just as I remembered: pressed shirt leather, briefcase, eyes that missed nothing. He sat across from me, lowered his voice, and slid a thick manila folder across the table. "Bob, the Thompsons are not who they pretend to be," he said. I opened the folder and felt my stomach turn. Bank statements, photocopied invoices, property records, it was all there. Pages of neat columns and dates that told a story far uglier than Emily's Facebook fairy tale. They've evaded at least $400,000 in taxes over the last 3 years, Stephen continued, tapping the documents with a practiced hand. Their restaurant, Thompson's Fine Dining, is a front. They run money through it like a laundromat: phantom catering services, inflated supply invoices, fake deposits. I called 3 of these catering companies. Half don't exist. The other half never worked with them. I adjusted my reading glasses and studied the statements. One deposit stood out: $53,000 from Heritage Wedding Catering. I knew the name instantly. It had shown up in one of Emily's bridal photos, printed on an invoice Richard had left carelessly on a table. "They claim to make $80,000 a year," Stephen went on. "But last year alone, they bought a $2.3 million mansion, paid cash for BMWs, and maintained country club memberships that cost more than their reported income." The numbers don't add up. My banker instincts kicked in, the old thrill of spotting a discrepancy others overlooked. Structured deposits just under reporting thresholds. Invoice dates that didn't match actual events. Vendor names tied to disconnected numbers. It was textbook fraud, the kind I used to unravel for a living. They're not just hiding their own money. Stephen said, leaning back. They're likely cleaning cash for other people, too. This scale isn't about greed, it's about laundering. I closed the folder and sat back, the weight of it heavy in my hands. Emily had chosen these people over me. She had traded her father's steady pension for stolen wealth, and in doing so, she had tied her future to criminals. How solid is this, I asked. This I. Solid enough for the IRS, the state, and the FBI, Stephen replied. Every piece was obtained legally through public records and open-source investigation. It's airtight. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I thought about Emily in her wedding gown, glowing with happiness, and about Richard Thompson walking her down the aisle as though he'd earned the right. I set the folder gently on the table and said, "Good. Let's see how their empire holds up when the truth comes knocking." The invitation came through Emily, her voice sweet with forced cheer. "Dad, Richard and Margaret want to have you over for dinner. They really want to clear the air." Clear the air, that was laughable. But I agreed, because sometimes the best way to study an enemy is across their own table. Thompson's fine dining looked even more pretentious inside than it did from the street crystal chandelier's polished wood art that screamed old money. Emily met me at the hostess stand, practically buzzing with nervous energy. "They're already here, Dad. Table 12, Richard's favorite." Richard rose as we approached. Hand extended, the smile of a man who believed charm could hide corruption. "Robert, welcome to our little place." Little place. The building alone cost more than my house. Margaret remained seated, offering her hand like a queen granting an audience. "We're so glad you could join us." Emily's been so worried. I took my seat, noting the perfect vantage point Richard had chosen, center of the room with a view of nearly every table. A king surveying his kingdom. Wine arrived almost instantly. Richard waved the waiter over and ordered a Bordeaux that cost more than most families' weekly groceries. "Only the best for our girl," he said, beaming at Emily. I swirled the glass, but my eyes weren't on the wine. They were on the quiet exchanges happening around us. At the table behind Richard, a businessman slid an envelope across to a woman who tucked it into her purse without even glancing inside. No receipt, no check stub, just cash. I sipped the wine, letting it linger while my mind cataloged. Transaction 1. Margaret launched into wedding details, the $12,000 floral arrangements, the imported linens, the guest list filled with senators and judges. Each word was laced with condescension, as if reminding me I could never compete. "Emily deserves perfection," she said. "She certainly does," I replied evenly while my eyes tracked another envelope changing hands at a nearby table. Transaction 2. The longer I sat, the clearer the pattern became. Servers disappeared into the kitchen with bulging aprons only to return lighter. Guests signed fake invoices before slipping folded stacks of cash across the table. It wasn't fine dining. It was a laundering floor disguised as luxury. "Business has been good," Richard bragged, leaning back in his chair. "Private events, catering weddings, profit margins are incredible." I offered a polite nod, though I knew the truth. Incredible profit margins usually meant incredible fraud. Emily beamed, oblivious. She leaned against my arm and whispered, "See, Dad. We're all family now. Family." I looked at Richard, then at Margaret, their smug faces glowing in the candlelight. If only Emily knew the price of her new family's generosity. By dessert, I had silently documented 17 suspicious exchanges. My phone, angled carefully under the table, captured photographs of invoices left carelessly behind. One even bore the name Heritage Wedding Catering, the same phantom company Stephen had flagged. Richard raised his glass. To family, he toasted. I met his eyes across the table, raised my own glass, and said softly, to getting exactly what we deserve. My dining room table had never looked like this before. For years, it had hosted Thanksgiving turkeys and birthday cakes. Now it was buried under stacks of photocopied bank statements, fake invoices, and property records. Stephen's investigation files sat in one pile, my own photographs from the restaurant in another. Together they painted a picture darker than Emily could imagine. I worked with the precision of a man returning to his old craft. Each document was logged into a ledger cross-referenced with dates and scanned onto multiple drives. Redundancy was a habit I'd never lost from banking. If one copy vanished, two more would survive. The plan formed as naturally as breathing. First, I would report the Thompsons to the proper authorities. Not in a haphazard way, but through carefully written complaints, each supported with evidence. I spent hours drafting a 12-page dossier for the IRS outlining exactly how Thompson's fine dining funneled unreported income through phantom catering services. I printed another for the State Revenue Department and a third for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Each envelope thick, heavy, undeniable. But I wasn't finished. Emily didn't need lectures. She didn't need another argument where she dismissed me as bitter or jealous. She needed proof, something so undeniable that even her pride couldn't spin it away. That's where the portfolio came in. I chose a leather binder I'd once used for high-level audits, its cover still smooth despite the years. Into it, I slid the documents in chronological order, the earliest fake invoices, the bank statements showing structured deposits, the property purchases that dwarfed their reported income. Every page told a story, and together they formed a narrative of theft, fraud, and greed. On the first page, I placed a simple note in my own handwriting, so you can see who your real parents truly are. Love, Dad. It was the most important gift I had ever given her, truth wrapped in leather. The house was silent, except for the hum of the printer. Outside, neighbors went about their ordinary evenings, unaware that inside a father was preparing to detonate his daughter's illusion of a perfect family. Once the portfolio was finished, I placed it carefully on the table, staring at it as though it were a weapon. In a sense, it was. The next morning, I drove to 3 different post offices across Spokane, mailing my official complaints from separate locations. Anonymous tips, each with the same evidence, each addressed to a different agency. By the time the Thompsons realized what was happening, their empire would already be under federal scrutiny. When I returned home, I pressed my best suit, polished my shoes, and set the portfolio beside them. My insurance policy was in place. The agencies would move slowly, but Emily's wedding was just days away. And when she opened my gift in front of 200 guests, there would be no going back. I stood at the mantel, straightened my wife's photograph, and whispered, "Margaret, she won't thank me now. But one day she'll understand." 3 days before the wedding, my phone buzzed with a call I almost didn't answer. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, just as I had done with the 83 before it. But something in me, maybe the father, maybe the strategist, decided it was time. Dad, Emily's voice was softer than I remembered. Hesitant. "I'm so glad you picked up. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the leather portfolio resting on my desk. Inside it, her new family's secrets waited like coiled snakes. Sorry for what, Emily, I asked, my tone measured. For what I said. For the post. I was angry, and the Thompsons, they were disappointed we weren't talking. They said family should stick together. Her words tumbled out in a rush as though rehearsed. "I want you at the wedding, please. It wouldn't be right without you." I glanced at Margaret's photograph on the mantel, her calm smile seeming to ask whether this was genuine remorse or another performance. "That's kind of you," I said slowly. "I'll be there." Her relief was immediate audible. "Thank you, Dad. It means everything. Margaret is planning a speech about family. She wants to include you. They really care about making you feel part of this." Part of this? I nearly laughed. They wanted me present, but not as a father, more as a prop, to complete their perfect picture. Still, I let her believe she'd won. "I'll be there," I repeated. "And I have a gift for you. Something important." "A gift?" Her voice brightened, touched with the same excitement she once had as a child on Christmas morning. "What is it you'll see?" I replied, my tone steady. "But I want you to read it carefully after the ceremony. Promise me that, of course." "Thank you, Dad. I can't wait." When the call ended, I sat in silence. My daughter believed my presence was her victory proof that the Thompsons had mended the rift. She had no idea she'd just invited the one man capable of dismantling their empire into the very heart of their celebration. That evening, I reviewed the portfolio once more. Every page was in order: fraudulent invoices, inflated expenses, tax returns that bore no resemblance to reality. The narrative was airtight, the evidence undeniable. I slipped it into a sealed envelope and placed it inside my suit jacket. Later, as I polished my shoes and set out my tie, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see the broken man Emily had called a failure. I saw the banker again, the husband who had promised his dying wife he would protect their child, even from herself. The Thompsons wanted a flawless wedding, a testament to their wealth and generosity. What they would get instead was the truth delivered not in anger, but in the quiet, devastating way only evidence can. I whispered into the empty room. "Emily, you'll walk down the aisle believing you've gained a new family. By the time you open my gift, you'll know exactly what kind of family you've chosen." The morning of Emily's wedding arrived with a silence so sharp it almost hurt. I woke early, pressed my best suit, and set the sealed envelope carefully into the inner pocket of my jacket. It was light in weight, but I knew it carried more power than any check I could have written. The drive to Thompson's fine dining felt like entering enemy territory. The streets around the venue were lined with cars, black sedans, and imported SUVs, symbols of wealth and status. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed from one door to the next, their polished smiles betraying no hint of the corruption inside. When I stepped out, Emily spotted me instantly. She was radiant in lace and silk, her face glowing with that happiness only brides carry. "Dad, you came." She rushed toward me, arms outstretched, the kind of embrace I hadn't felt in years. I let her hold me, inhaling the faint trace of her mother's perfume that lingered in my memory. "I have something for you," I whispered, reaching into my jacket. I placed the envelope in her hands. "Open it later when you have time to really read." Her eyes brightened. "A gift, thank you, Dad. It means so much to me that you're here." She tucked the envelope into her bridal bag alongside lipstick and tissues, never realizing it was the most explosive gift she would ever receive. Inside, the ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and white roses, $12,000 worth. Margaret bragged later. Guests in gowns and tuxedos murmured about the generosity of the Thompsons, their incredible kindness in paying for such a spectacular event. I took my assigned seat, the third row of the family section, not the front row, not beside my daughter, but behind Richard's business partners and Margaret's distant cousins. Richard approached in his designer tuxedo chest, puffed with pride. "Robert," he said warmly, "Emily looks beautiful, doesn't she?" "She does indeed," I replied, keeping my voice calm, my eyes on him. The man who would walk my daughter down the aisle wasn't her father, but a criminal hiding behind silk and smiles. Margaret glided past, glittering with jewelry, pausing only to pat my shoulder. We're so glad you came. It means the world to Emily. We're all family now. Family. I bit back a bitter laugh. Family wasn't bought with forged invoices and laundered cash. But I smiled politely, letting them think they had won. When the music swelled and Emily appeared at the end of the aisle, my heart clenched. She was breathtaking, radiant, the little girl I'd once carried on my shoulders, now walking toward a life she believed was secure. Only she wasn't on my arm, she was holding Richard's. The crowd murmured approval, photographers snapped pictures, and I sat silently, the envelope pressing against her bridal bag like a ticking clock. As vows were spoken and champagne glasses clinked, I watched from my seat. The Thompsons basked in admiration, blind to the fact that their kingdom was already collapsing. I whispered under my breath, too softly for anyone to hear, "Enjoy your day of triumph, Richard. Tonight the truth comes home." The ceremony began with the kind of pomp that only money could buy. The chandeliers above the ballroom threw light across the roses and silks, each arrangement costing more than I'd once paid for a year of groceries. A string quartet played softly as Emily, radiant in her gown, walked down the aisle on Richard Thompson's arm. The crowd gasped at her beauty, at his supposed generosity, never knowing what lay beneath the surface. I sat in the third row, the Thompsons' chosen place for me, close enough to be visible, far enough to remind everyone who held the real power. Guests whispered around me, "The Thompsons have been so good to her. Such lucky parents. What a beautiful family." Each word pierced like a knife, but I held my composure. Let them talk. Soon their tune would change. Margaret dabbed her eyes delicately with a silk handkerchief, the image of a doting mother. Richard stood tall, every inch the proud patriarch. They were actors in a carefully staged play, and the audience was buying every line. I, however, was not their audience. My eyes kept drifting to the bridal bag sitting near the head table, the envelope tucked safely inside. My gift. My truth. Jason, nervous but earnest, recited his vows. His voice cracked, but sincerity shone through. Emily followed, her eyes glistening as she thanked the Thompsons for making her dreams possible. Not once did she mention me. My presence, it seemed, was enough for her, my approval assumed by my attendance. She had no idea that the real father she had dismissed as a failure was about to strip her benefactors bare in front of 200 witnesses. The officiant spoke of love, of loyalty, of family values. His words echoed through the hall, but they rang hollow in my ears. What value did the Thompsons know of loyalty? Their entire empire was built on betrayal, betrayal of the tax system of their community, of every law-abiding citizen who struggled while they flourished through fraud. When Jason kissed Emily, applause erupted. Rice and flower petals showered, the air cameras flashed, and Margaret clasped her hands as though presenting her daughter to the world. Richard leaned down to whisper something to Emily, and she laughed, radiant. For that moment, they looked like the family she had always wanted. But I knew better. And soon so would she. As guests filed toward the reception hall, I remained seated for a beat longer, watching them. Two criminals celebrated as saints, my daughter blind to the truth, and me, the man they had cast aside, waiting with the patience of someone who had spent decades following money trails to their bitter end. I rose, slowly smoothed the front of my suit, and followed the crowd into the reception. My hand brushed against my jacket pocket, where copies of the same evidence sat as backup. One way or another, the truth would surface. They thought this day belonged to them. But weddings are about unions, about truth revealed before witnesses. And tonight, everyone here would witness exactly what kind of family Emily had chosen. The reception hall glittered like a palace. Crystal stemware caught the candlelight, silverware gleamed against white linens, and waiters in black vests moved like clockwork filling glasses before they were half empty. A jazz trio played softly near the stage, their music blending with the hum of conversation. I took my place at the table assigned to me, neither front nor back, but carefully positioned where I could see everything. From here, I had a perfect view of the head table where Emily and Jason sat, flanked by Richard and Margaret, the self-proclaimed real parents. They glowed under the attention, basking in compliments from business associates and country club friends. Guests leaned in to thank them for their generosity, their kindness, their unbelievable support. I sipped my wine slowly, letting it linger while I studied the room. This was more than a wedding reception. It was a stage play, and the Thompsons had cast themselves as benefactors of the year. Every detail screamed excess lobster tails, stacked high imported champagne, flowing freely floral arrangements large enough to fill living rooms. And then there was Emily, radiant in her gown, smiling as though this night had erased every cruel word she'd spoken to me. She glanced my way, once her eyes soft as if my presence alone was proof she had been forgiven. She didn't know the envelope rested in her bridal bag, silent and heavy, waiting for its moment. Richard tapped his glass, drawing attention. "Friends, family, thank you for joining us on this most joyous occasion." Margaret and I could not be prouder of Emily and Jason. His voice carried the authority of a man used to applause. It came loud and unhesitating. Margaret stood her handkerchief ready. "Family is everything," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "We're honored to stand beside Emily as she begins this beautiful new chapter." She turned, smiling at me. "And we're so grateful that Robert could be here tonight. Family should always come together." The crowd nodded, murmuring approval. To them it was a touching moment. To me it was theater. The woman laundering money through fake catering services was now giving a speech about family values. If irony had weight, it would have crushed the room. I raised my glass, politely masking the bitterness boiling inside. My time was coming, and I needed patience. Dinner moved into dancing laughter, spilling across the hall as champagne loosened tongues. Businessmen toasted Richard for his success. Women admired Margaret's taste, and Emily floated from table to table, glowing like she belonged to royalty. I sat back, memorizing every detail, every smug expression, every careless boast. Because when the truth landed, when that envelope was opened, this glittering spectacle would transform into chaos. My eyes followed Emily as she finally returned to the head table, reaching into her bridal bag for lipstick. Her hand brushed against the envelope and she smiled, curious. The moment was drawing closer. I folded my napkin, deliberately placed it on the table, and whispered under my breath, "Time to meet your real family, Emily." It happened quietly at first. Emily had been laughing with Jason, adjusting her veil as the photographer circled the head table when her hand drifted again into her bridal bag. She pulled out lipstick, reapplied, then paused. Her fingers brushed against the envelope I'd given her that morning. She smiled, curious, and held it up. "Dad, what's this?" she called across the room. 200 heads turned toward me. I didn't flinch. "Open it, sweetheart," I said evenly. "It's something special." The hall hushed as she broke the seal. Cameras still flashed, but now they caught confusion rather than celebration. Emily unfolded the first page, the cover letter I'd written in my own hand. "Dear daughter, meet your real parents. Love, Dad." Her smile faltered. She glanced at me, uncertain, before pulling out the stack of documents beneath. Bank statements, tax returns, photographs of invoices from companies that didn't exist. The pages slipped between her silk-gloved fingers, each one heavier than the last. "What is this?" Jason asked, leaning closer. Emily spread the papers across the white tablecloth, her face drained of color as she read numbers that told a story no bouquet could hide. She looked from the documents to Margaret, then to Richard. Is this true? Margaret's hand shot out, reaching for the papers. Emily, dear, don't too late. Guests at nearby tables had already seen. Phones rose like a field of periscopes, snapping photographs of every incriminating page. Whispers spread sharp as broken glass. Richard stood, face red, voice booming. Lies, all lies. Your father's bitter. He can't stand that we gave you what he couldn't. I rose slowly from my seat, my voice calm but carrying. $400,000 in unreported income. Money laundered through phantom catering companies. Your wedding paid for with stolen money, Emily. That's the truth. The ballroom erupted. Guests leaned across tables, murmuring accusations. Some backed away as though sitting beside the Thompsons might taint them. Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, her composure cracking. Emily clutched the papers, her hands trembling. All this time. All of this. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Richard, then at Margaret. You bought me with money you stole. Jason read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as realization hit. Mom, Dad. What is this? Richard tried to recover, raising his voice above the chaos. This is nonsense. Robert's jealous, envious of what we've built. I cut him off, my words sharp and steady. The IRS doesn't think so. Or the State Revenue Department. Or the FBI. They all received copies of these documents 3 days ago. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones clicked faster now, capturing every word, every twitch of panic on Richard's face. Emily's mascara streaked down her cheeks as she whispered, Dad. Oh, God. I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on her, not them. Sweetheart, I didn't want to ruin your wedding. I wanted you to see the truth. This is who your new parents really are. The ballroom felt like it had tilted on its axis. Just minutes before people had been clinking glasses and congratulating the Thompsons. Now whispers spread like wildfire, the kind of whispers that ruin reputations before dessert is served. Phones hovered over the documents scattered across the head table. Every guest was capturing history, the unraveling of a family built on fraud. Margaret lunged again for the papers, her jewelry flashing under the lights. Emily, don't listen. These are fabrications. Your father is trying to destroy your happiness. Emily yanked the pages back, tears streaking her face. Fabrications. These are bank records, tax filings, invoices from companies that don't exist. Why would he make this up? Richard's face turned crimson. He pounded the table so hard glasses rattled. Because he's jealous, he couldn't provide for you, so he's trying to ruin us. I stepped forward, my voice steady but sharp. Jealous, no, Richard. I'm a banker. Numbers don't lie, and neither do public records. What you've been hiding is written right here for everyone to see. The crowd stirred, some edging closer to the head table for a better look. A businessman whispered to his wife, If this is true, they're finished. Another muttered, I knew nobody could afford this lifestyle, honestly. Jason finally stood his chair, scraping against the polished floor. He looked at the documents, then at his parents. Tell me this isn't real. Please. Richard opened his mouth, but Margaret spoke first, her voice desperate. Jason, honey, it's complicated. Business is complicated. You wouldn't understand. Complicated. Jason's voice cracked. You built my wedding on stolen money. You paraded us in front of 200 people while laundering cash. His hands shook as he turned to Emily. We can't live like this. Emily broke down completely, clutching the papers as if they were burning her hands. Everything I believed. All the generosity, the kindness. It was a lie. She looked at me, then her eyes hollow with regret. Dad, I called you a failure. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You weren't the failure, sweetheart. They were. The room erupted again, guests calling out questions, some already backing toward the exits, unwilling to be associated with a scandal about to hit the front page. The photographer hired to capture a fairy tale now snapped, shot after shot of a nightmare. Margaret pale, Richard enraged, Emily crumbling, me standing calmly among the wreckage. Richard finally lost control. He pointed at me, voice shaking with rage. You'll regret this. Do you hear me? You've ruined everything. I met his eyes without flinching. No, Richard. You ruined yourself the moment you decided fraud was easier than honesty. All I did was bring the truth into the light. The ballroom buzzed with energy, part horror, part fascination. People filmed, people whispered, people judged. In one night, the Thompsons had lost the only thing they valued more than money, their reputation. And standing there beside my daughter, I knew this was only the beginning. The real reckoning, the legal reckoning, was still to come. 5 days after the wedding, I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, Emily stood there, her once perfect posture collapsed into something smaller, fragile. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her makeup smeared, and in her arms she carried expensive gifts, designer handbags, diamond jewelry, a silk shawl still in its box. They looked more like shackles than treasures. Dad. Her voice cracked as she stepped inside. She placed the gifts on my coffee table as though they were poisoned. I'm so sorry. I was a terrible daughter. She sank into the same chair where just weeks earlier she had called me a failure. Now she looked nothing like the woman who had dismissed me for the Thompsons' wealth. She was pale, trembling, stripped of her certainty. I didn't rush to comfort her. Instead, I sat across from her and let the silence settle, heavy but not cruel. Finally, I said, Emily, you don't need to apologize to me. You need to understand the truth. Tears spilled over as she opened one of the jewelry boxes, staring at the glittering bracelet Richard had proudly given her. I can't keep any of this. Every time I look at it, I see stolen money. Lies. They bought me, and I let them. She shoved the box back onto the pile. How can you even look at me? I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. Because you're my daughter. And unlike them, my love for you doesn't come with a price tag. She buried her face in her hands. The IRS came yesterday. They shut down the restaurant, took boxes of files. Reporters were outside, Dad. Neighbors whispering. Jason's devastated. He never suspected anything. I don't know how to live with this. I let out a slow breath. The agencies had moved faster than I expected. The complaints I filed had taken root. This is what happens when people build their lives on fraud. The truth always catches up, Emily. Sometimes later than we'd like, but it always comes. She looked at me through her tears. You could have just told me. You could have warned me before the wedding. I shook my head. Would you have believed me without proof, or would you have thought your bitter father was jealous, trying to ruin your happiness? She hesitated, then whispered, I would have chosen them anyway. Because of their money. The honesty stung, but it was what I'd known all along. And now you see what money like that really costs. Emily reached for one of the family photos on the mantel, her, as a child, smiling in her mother's arms. I wish Mom were here. She would have seen through them, wouldn't she? She always said the most expensive gifts often come with the highest cost, I reminded her. We sat in silence for a while, the pile of luxury items between us, like a monument to everything she had learned the hardest way possible. Finally, Emily whispered, Dad, will you help me start over? I nodded, my throat tight. That's what real family does. The next morning, Emily arrived with cardboard boxes. Together, we emptied her apartment piece by piece. Designer clothes, still with tags, handbags she had flaunted, online jewelry boxes Margaret had insisted she needed. All of it went into the boxes. She didn't cry this time. Her face was set, her movements purposeful. I can't keep any of this, she said firmly. It's tainted. Every item feels like a debt I can never repay. We loaded the boxes into my old truck and drove them to a local charity. The volunteers' eyes widened as they pulled diamond-studded earrings and silk gowns from the pile. Emily stood beside me, shoulders squared. Someone else can make use of it. I just want it gone. For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of the girl I used to know, the one her mother and I had raised to value kindness over appearances. That afternoon, news broke. Federal agents had officially filed charges against Richard and Margaret Thompson, tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering. Their restaurant was closed, their accounts frozen, their names plastered across headlines. Society couple accused in $400,000 fraud scheme. The same community that had applauded them at the wedding now turned away in disgust. Emily sat at my kitchen table staring at the newspaper. Dad, they called me last night. Begged me to speak to reporters to defend them. Said family should stick together. And what did you say? I asked. She met my eyes, her voice steady. I hung up. For the first time in my life, I didn't listen. Pride swelled in me, though I kept my expression calm. That's good, Emily. They made their choices. Now they face the consequences. Jason joined us later that evening. He looked older than his years, his tie loosened, his face pale. I had no idea, he said, voice breaking. I believed them. I thought everything they gave us came from hard work. I studied him carefully. His grief seemed genuine, his shock real. Deception like theirs works because it looks so convincing. You weren't blind, Jason. You were manipulated. Emily placed a hand over his. We can't undo what they did, but we can choose who we are now. They both looked at me as though waiting for permission. I thought of Margaret, of the promise I'd made her on her deathbed, to protect our daughter even when she didn't want protecting. Then start small, I said. Live honestly. Build something real. It won't be flashy, but it will last. Emily nodded slowly. Dad, I want a proper blessing ceremony. Not the spectacle they bought. Just us, a few friends, something simple. Will you walk me down the aisle this time? My throat tightened. I'd be honored. That night, as I closed the curtains, I realized something remarkable. The Thompsons had lost everything they valued, while I had regained the one thing they could never buy, my daughter's trust. We sat at the kitchen table, a yellow notepad between us. No florists, no photographers, no endless invoices, just Emily, Jason, and me scribbling down names of the people who had truly mattered in her life. Teachers who had encouraged her, childhood friends who had stood by her through hard times, neighbors who had brought casseroles when her mother was sick. It was a list of loyalty, not wealth. This feels right, Emily said, tapping her pen against the paper. No gowns worth thousands of dollars, no $12,000 flower arrangements. Just honesty. I smiled, remembering her mother's words. The most important things in life don't need to be expensive, they need to be real. Meanwhile, the Thompsons were everywhere in the news. Every headline screamed their disgrace. Photos of federal agents carrying boxes from their restaurant filled the front pages. The same papers that once praised their charity galas now cataloged their crimes. Community icons indicted. Lavish lifestyle funded by fraud. On the evening news, I watched their mansion flash across the screen, agents swarming the driveway, while neighbors looked on. Margaret's face appeared in one clip, pale and drawn. Her jewelry gone, her practiced smile replaced by something hollow. Richard shouted at reporters, insisting he was the victim of a vendetta. No one believed him anymore. Emily turned off the television, shaking her head. I can't believe I thought they were perfect. They were just actors, Dad. And I was too blind to see the script. You weren't blind, I said gently. You were grieving your mother, vulnerable, looking for comfort in the wrong places. They saw that and took advantage. Jason spoke quietly from across the table. People at my job look at me differently now. They think I was in on it. I didn't know, but I can't blame them for wondering. Emily reached for his hand. We'll prove ourselves, Jason. Together. She turned back to me. That's why I want this new ceremony. No lies, no performance. Just truth. I nodded, making a small note on the pad. Backyard under the oak tree. Margaret always loved that spot. Emily's eyes softened, brimming with tears. Mom would have loved it. She believed in simple joys. She'd be proud of us. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt peace. The Thompsons were unraveling, publicly stripped of the reputation they'd built on lies. And in that unraveling, my daughter was finding her way back, not just to me, but to the values her mother had lived by. We ended the night in the living room, flipping through old photo albums. Emily lingered over one picture of her 5th birthday, paper hats, homemade cake, and me holding her on my shoulders. She smiled faintly. This was happiness, and it didn't cost a cent. I placed my hand on hers. That's the lesson, Emily. Real joy can't be bought. And neither can family. It was a Thursday morning when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Robert, it's Margaret Thompson. Her voice was hoarse, but still carried the old air of entitlement. We need to meet, privately. This circus has gotten out of control, and you're the one who can stop it. I almost laughed. Stop it, Margaret, you built this circus. I just turned on the lights. She exhaled sharply. You don't understand. The papers, the TV crews. Our lives are being destroyed. Emily won't answer my calls. If you care about your daughter's reputation, you'll help us clear this up. My daughter's reputation is already being restored, I said. It's yours that's finished. There was a pause, then Richard's voice thundered on the line. You self-righteous old fool. Do you think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. Without us, your daughter has nothing. I let his words hang before replying, calm as ever. She has me. And that's more than you ever gave her. I hung up before he could respond. 2 days later, they tried to fight back publicly. The Thompsons held a press conference on the courthouse steps, Margaret in a muted suit, Richard in his usual smug stance. Cameras crowded around as they proclaimed their innocence, painting themselves as victims of a jealous father who had fabricated lies out of bitterness. But this time the crowd didn't applaud. Reporters shouted questions armed with the very documents I had leaked to a trusted journalist as backup. Copies of fraudulent invoices and bank statements flashed on live television. One reporter asked Richard directly, if these are lies, why do these invoices trace back to your restaurant accounts? Richard's face twitched, his polished facade cracking under the heat of exposure. Margaret tried to smile, but her voice faltered. We'll explain everything in court. I watched the spectacle from my living room, Emily by my side. Her hand tightened around mine. They're still trying to spin it. Even now. They can try, I said quietly, but the truth doesn't bend forever. Eventually, it breaks those who fight it. The fallout was swift. The country club expelled them. Their so-called friends stopped returning calls. Businesses that once courted their patronage now distanced themselves publicly. The Thompsons hadn't just lost their money, they'd lost their standing. And for people like them, reputation was everything. That night, Emily turned to me, tears in her eyes. "Dad, if you hadn't done this, I would still be blind. I would still believe they were my saviors." I squeezed her hand gently. Sometimes the only way to protect someone you love is to let the truth hurt them first. Outside, the headlines rolled on, but I no longer needed to read them. I had seen enough. The world finally knew what I had known all along. Richard and Margaret Thompson weren't saviors. They were thieves dressed in silk and lies. And now they were out of places to hide. The day of Emily's new ceremony dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring morning that carried no trace of scandal or shame. In my backyard, beneath the wide arms of the old oak tree, a handful of chairs had been set up. No crystal chandeliers, no imported flowers, just wildflowers from a neighbor's garden, and ribbons Emily had tied herself. Jason stood nervously at the makeshift altar, his tie slightly crooked. Emily walked toward him in a simple white dress she'd found at a local boutique. No designer label, no $1,000 veil, just fabric that moved gently in the breeze. And when she smiled at me before I took her arm, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, sincerity unclouded by entitlement. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes shimmering, "will you walk me down this time?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, with pride. As we walked together, the guests, true friends, neighbors, a few relatives who had stood by us rose to their feet. There were no flashes from photographers, no applause from business partners, no whispers of wealth. Just warmth, real and unpretentious. At the altar, Emily turned to me and pressed my hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for loving me even when I didn't deserve it." I kissed her forehead, then placed her hand in Jason's. "Take care of her," I told him. "Not with money, with honesty." The ceremony was short and tender. Vows spoken without grandeur, but with truth. Jason promised to build a life with integrity, to never let deception poison their home. Emily promised to love through hardship, to value what cannot be bought. And as they exchanged rings, the simplicity of the moment struck me. It was everything the grand spectacle at Thompson's fine dining had failed to be. Afterward, we shared food set out on picnic tables, homemade casseroles, pies from neighbors, lemonade in mason jars. Laughter floated in the air, light and genuine. No one cared about appearances. We cared about being together. Later, Emily and I sat on the porch steps, the sounds of celebration drifting around us. She leaned against me like she had when she was a little girl. "Dad," she said, "I thought wealth meant security, but it blinded me. What you gave me, what Mom gave me, was so much more. I just couldn't see it until I lost everything else." I placed my arm around her shoulders. "You didn't lose everything, Emily. You found yourself. And you came home." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, but her smile was steady. Mom would have loved this day. I looked up at the branches overhead, sunlight streaming through. "She would have," I said. "Because this is real family." For the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt peace settle in my chest. The Thompsons had been exposed, their empire crumbling under the weight of truth. But here in my backyard, beneath an old oak tree, my daughter had been restored to me. And that was victory enough. Looking back, I realize my daughter's betrayal cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. To be called a failure, to be replaced by strangers she called her real parents, nearly broke me. But sometimes pain forces us to act with clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't seek revenge with anger. I simply followed the truth, documented it, and let the evidence speak louder than emotions ever could. The Thompsons had everything money could buy, mansions, cars, influence, but none of it could shield them from justice. And when their empire collapsed, all that remained was what truly mattered: the bond between a father and his daughter, rebuilt not with wealth, but with honesty. If you're a parent or even a child who has taken love for granted, I hope this story makes you pause. The most expensive gifts in life often come with the highest cost. Real family isn't about the money spent, it's about who shows up when everything else falls apart. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a betrayal that forced you to rethink what family really means? How did you handle it, and what did you learn? Share your story in the comments so we can all grow from it together. If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share. And remember, sometimes the quietest strength is the one that speaks the loudest truth. Thank you for listening.